Welcome back to another deep dive, folks. Today we're taking a look at something that's uh, pretty fundamental, I'd say, to how we understand, well, just about everything, really. It's this philosophical problem of material constitution.
Wow. Yes. It's yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. We think about objects like what makes them what they are, how they stay the same over time even when they change.
Right. And what's the relationship between, like, the stuff an object is made of and the object itself? I mean, these questions have been keeping philosophers up at night for centuries, and for good reason, too. It gets to the heart of how we think about identity, persistence, even reality itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those areas in philosophy where, you start with what seem like really simple everyday objects, but before you know it, you're down this rabbit hole of these head-spinning paradoxes and counterintuitive conclusions.
And for our deep dive today, we're turning to, well, one of the most trusted resources in philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a great guide for us and for you, our listener, because we're going to break down some of the classic philosophical puzzles about material constitution, along with some of the most interesting and, frankly, mind-bending solutions that have been proposed.
And I think what makes this particularly fascinating, at least for me, is how these ideas, these solutions, they really push us to examine our most basic assumptions about what it means for something to be something, how we define identity, and how we make sense of change in a world where things are constantly in flux.
So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with something fun, a paradox. And not just any paradox, but one that tackles, well, debt. I mean, who doesn't love a good philosophical problem about owing money, right? This is the debtor's paradox, and it goes way back to
Oh,
Epicharmus.
yes, the debtor's paradox,
hmm
a classic.
So, imagine this. Someone's being asked to repay a debt, right? But instead of just, paying up, they start getting all philosophical. They say, well, if you add one grain of sand to a pile, you get a new pile, right?
Okay, I'm following so far.
And they continue, and if you add an inch to a ruler, it's a new measurement.
Yeah, I see where they're going with this.
So they apply the same logic to themselves. They're like, hey, I'm constantly changing, new cells, new experiences. I'm not the same person I was when I took out that loan.
So their argument is because they've changed, the debt isn't really theirs anymore.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because the creditor comes back with an equally absurd counter-argument.
Oh, I bet I can guess this one. Something like, well, if you're not the same person who borrowed the money, then I'm not the same person who lent it to you, so you don't owe me anything.
You got it. Or even, if I punch you right now, I wouldn't be punching the same person who tried to cheat me out of my money. It highlights how this kind of rigid thinking about identity, where it's all tied up in the specific matter at a specific time, just leads to these ridiculous conclusions.
Right. And it really forces us to ask, what does make a person the same person over time? Or, any object for that matter. Is it really just about the stuff it's made of, or is there something more going on?
And this leads us perfectly to our next philosophical head-scratcher, known as the puzzle of Dion and Theon. This one comes from Chrysippus.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right, so picture this.
Mm-hmm.
You have Dion, a whole person, right? Just a regular guy.
Got it.
Now imagine Theon. Theon is exactly like Dion, except he's missing a foot.
So Theon is like a part of Dion.
Exactly. Now that missing foot gets detached. It seems pretty clear that Theon, having not actually lost any of his parts, still exists. But here's the philosophical wrench in the works. If we say that Dion also exists, even after losing his foot, we've got two different people occupying the same space.
Ah, I see the problem. That's definitely a bit of a philosophical pickle.
Hmm.
So we're left wondering, can an object lose a part and still be the same object?
Exactly. And this leads us to a modern version of the same puzzle, Tibble's the cat and Tib the cat minus the tail.
Ah, yes, the telltale. It's a great illustration of how this seemingly simple question about parts and wholes can lead to some really perplexing conclusions.
Now, let's sail into perhaps one of the most famous puzzles in all of philosophy, the ship of Theseus. This one was originally posed by Plutarch, but it was Hobbes who really threw in a mind-blowing twist.
This is the one with the ship that gets, slowly rebuilt over time.
Exactly. So you have the ship, Theseus's famous vessel. It starts to get old, planks rot, and they get replaced one by one.
Okay, sounds like a pretty standard ship maintenance routine.
Right. But eventually, every single piece of the original ship has been replaced. So the question is it still the same ship of Theseus?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough one. On the one hand, it's been continuously repaired, so it seems like it should still be the same ship. But on the other hand, None of the original material is there anymore.
And this is where Hobbes comes in with his genius twist. He says, okay, what if someone collected all the old planks, all the original pieces, and built a second ship out of them? Now we have two ships, both claiming to be the original ship of Theseus. Which one is the real one? Could they both be? And could the original ship somehow exist in two places at the same time? It really makes you question what makes an object the same object through time, especially when it's undergoing constant change.
It's a brilliant puzzle, and it highlights how our intuitions about identity, about what makes something the same over time, can really come into conflict. Like, do we prioritize the matter, the form, the history? The Ship of Theseus forces us to think about these criteria for identity in a really deep way.
All right, ready for one more puzzle before we dive into the possible solutions?
Hit me with it.
Okay, this one's a real doozy, and it's been a central problem in the philosophy of material constitution for a long time. The puzzle of the statue and the clay.
Sounds intriguing. Lay it on me.
So picture this. You have a sculptor, right? Let's call him Bob. On Monday, Bob has this big lump of clay. Let's just call it lump.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Bob, lump, Monday.
On Tuesday, Bob gets to work and he sculpts this amazing statue of, let's say, David. So now we have David the statue.
All right, so far so good.
Now, at first glance, you might think, well, David is just lump, just shaped differently.
Yeah, it seems straightforward enough.
But here's where things get complicated. Lump existed on Monday, right? But David, the statue, didn't. He didn't come into being until Tuesday.
Ah, I see. So there's a difference in their histories.
Exactly, and there's more. Lump could, get squished back into a shapeless blob of clay and still be lump warrior, right? But if you squish David, he wouldn't be David anymore. He'd just be a smashed up lump of clay again.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even though they might be made of the same stuff, they have different possibilities, different futures.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really philosophically interesting. Because we have this principle called Leibniz's law that says if two things are truly identical, they have to have all the same properties.
Right. Same thing, same properties. It seems pretty basic.
But Lump and David, they have different properties, different histories, different possibilities for what can happen to them. So according to Leibniz's law, they can't be the same thing.
So what does that mean? We have two different things in the same space at the same time.
That's the conclusion we seem to be forced to accept. Spatially coincident objects. Two distinct things occupying the same space at the same time. It's a real head-scratcher, and it's a problem that has led to a lot of philosophical debate and some really creative solutions.
Yeah, I can imagine. So how have philosophers tried to untangle this knot?
Well, that's what we're going to get into next. But first, let's lay out the core of the problem. The Stanford Encyclopedia gives us these 4 premises, and they all seem pretty reasonable, right? First, David didn't exist on Monday.
Okay, that one seems pretty clear.
Second, lump did exist on Monday.
Yep, that follows.
Third, if those first 2 premises are true, then David isn't the same thing as lump.
Right, because they have different properties, what we talked about.
And then the final conclusion. David isn't the same thing as lump, which means we have 2 distinct objects in the same place at the same time on Tuesday.
Okay, so that's the puzzle in a nutshell. So where do we go from here?
Well, the encyclopedia then lays out 5 general categories of replies that philosophers have come up with to deal with this conundrum. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into the deep end of material constitution theory.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right, let's start with what's probably the most popular solution to this whole statue and clay mess. Coincident objects.
Coincident objects. So we're just accepting that two things can be in the same place at the same time.
Basically, yeah. It's often called the constitution view because the idea is that lump constitutes David. It's what he's made of, but they're not actually the same thing.
Okay, I can see how that might work. But how do they deal with, like, the whole two things can't be in the same place idea? That seems pretty fundamental.
Right. That's called the impenetrability objection. And they deal with it by saying, well, what if David and lump actually share all their parts? They're materially coincident. They're distinct objects, but they're made of the same basic stuff.
That's interesting. So how do they explain the fact that they'd have the same weight then?
Well, they'd say that the weight comes from the parts, right? So if they share all the same parts, they'd naturally have the same weight. You wouldn't add their weights together because that would be double counting the parts.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the fact that, wholes are supposed to be determined by their parts? Like if David and lump have all the same parts, how can they be different things?
Right, that's the extensionality objection. And there are a few ways the coincident objects folks try to handle that. Some say, well, maybe we need to rethink the whole idea that objects are only determined by their parts. Maybe there's something else going on. Others say that, well, maybe David and Lump don't actually share all their parts. Like maybe David's shape, his specific sculpted features, those are parts of him that aren't parts of just a formless lump of clay.
Interesting. So they're trying to find ways to differentiate them, even if they're made of the same stuff.
Exactly. And another common way they try to do that is by bringing in the idea of form. Like David and Lump might have the same matter, but they have different forms. David has the form of a statue, which Lump obviously doesn't.
Ah, so they're drawing on, like, the classic Aristotelian concept of form.
Exactly. But this leads to another objection, the grounding objection.
Grounding, what's that all about?
Well, it's basically asking, okay, if David and Lump are made of the exact same stuff, how can they have different properties? Like, how can Lump have existed on Monday when David didn't? How can Lump survive being squashed when David can't? If they're physically identical, shouldn't they have the same properties?
Ah, I see. So how do they get around that?
One common strategy is to appeal to differences in kind. Like, Lump is a lump of clay, David is a statue, and these different kinds just have different persistence conditions.
Okay, but then you have to explain why, if they're materially the same, they belong to different kinds in the first place, right?
Right, and that's where it gets really tricky. Some say, well, maybe the difference in kind comes from relational properties. Like, David is a statue because he was sculpted, he's part of the art world, while Lump isn't.
Interesting. So it's not just about what they're made of, but also their relationship to other things, to intentions, to history.
Exactly. But there are problems with that view, too. For example, there's this famous thought experiment where you have Goliath and Lumpel.
Goliath and Lumpel. Okay, this sounds like a good one.
So Goliath is a statue just like David. But Lumpel is, well, just a lump of clay. But here's the twist. Lumpel has all the same historical properties as Goliath.
So they were created at the same time, in the same way, everything.
Yep. But we still have this strong intuition that they're different kinds of things, even though their histories are the same. This suggests that just appealing to history and intentions might not be enough to fully explain the difference.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what other challenges do the coincident objects people face?
Well, there's the anthropic objection, which is sometimes called the explosion of reality argument.
Explosion of reality. That sounds dramatic.
It is. So the argument goes like this. If we accept that David and Lump can exist in the same place at the same time, then what's stopping us from saying that there are a whole bunch of other weird objects also occupying that same space? Like, what about the in statue that only exists when it's indoors?
The in statue.
Or the lit statue that only exists when the lights are on? If we can have David and Lump coexisting, why not a whole infinity of these bizarre objects defined by all sorts of crazy conditions?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. If we open the door to coincident objects, how do we keep things from getting out of hand?
Right, and some people who like the coincident objects view actually embrace this potential explosion of reality. They're like, well, maybe all those weird objects do exist, we just don't have words for them or care about them. But as the encyclopedia points out, this kind of thinking starts to push us towards a very different theory of material constitution, temporal parts.
Temporal parts. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
So imagine a road, right? It exists in different places because it has different parts in those places. Temporal parts theory says that objects exist through time in the same way. They have different temporal parts at different times.
Okay, so it's like a four-dimensional view of objects. They're stretched out through time.
Exactly. And in the case of David and Lump, it would mean that, yeah, they share some temporal parts, like on Tuesday when they both exist. But Lump also has temporal parts from Monday when David didn't exist yet. So they're not totally identical because they have different temporal parts over their whole existence.
That's a clever way to think about it.
Hmm.
So how does this view deal with all those objections we talked about, like the impenetrability objection?
Well, that one kind of goes away because at any given time, there's only one temporal part occupying that space. So David and Lump might share a temporal part on Tuesday, but they're not really two separate things occupying the same space at that instant.
Okay, so it avoids the whole two things in one place problem by slicing time up very thinly. What about the extensionality objection? How do they explain that David and Lump are different even if they share some temporal parts?
Well, they'd say that David and Lump are different because they don't share all their temporal parts. They only overlap for a certain period of time. Lump has a longer temporal worm, so to speak.
Makes sense. And the grounding objection, how do they explain the different properties?
A couple of ways. They might say, well, their temporal parts have different historical properties, or just they have different sets of temporal parts overall. And as for the anthropic objection, the explosion of reality, well, they could say that all those weird objects like the in statue and the lit statue, they all have their place in the four-dimensional world. They're just made up of very specific and maybe kind of strange collections of temporal parts.
But isn't that kind of a problem in itself? Like, isn't it a bit weird to say that all those strange objects actually exist?
Yeah, that's what some philosophers think. It's one of the main criticisms of the temporal parts view. But there's another big challenge for them, and it comes from the Lumpel and Goliath case we talked about earlier.
Ah, the lookalikes with identical histories.
Right, because if Lumpel and Goliath exist at exactly the same times, then they should have all the same temporal parts. And if they have all the same temporal parts, shouldn't they be identical? But we still have this strong intuition that they're different, especially when we think about what could happen to them.
Right, like Goliath could be made into a bust, but Lumpel could be squished flat. Different possibilities.
Exactly. So to deal with this, temporal parts folks often turn to David Lewis's counterpart theory.
Counterpart theory. Okay, what's that?
Well, it's a bit complicated, but the basic idea is that objects only really exist in one possible world, but they have counterparts in other possible worlds.
So, like, there's another world where I'm wearing a different shirt.
Yeah, something like that. But those other yous aren't really you, they're just your counterparts. And whether something in another world counts as your counterpart depends on how similar it is to you and what kind of similarity we're talking about.
Interesting. So how does this help with Lumpel and Goliath?
So they'd say that the statement, Goliath could survive being squashed, is false because there are no statue counterparts of Goliath in other possible worlds that survive being squashed. But Lumpel could survive being squashed is true because there are lump of clay counterparts of Lumpel in other possible worlds that survive being squashed.
Okay, so it's all about what kind of counterparts exist in other possible worlds.
Exactly. But even counterpart theory has its critics. Some philosophers point out that it doesn't really explain the differences between objects in the actual world. Like, what if Lumpel is well-made and Goliath is kind of crudely sculpted? That's not about what could happen to them, it's about how they are right now.
So it seems that even temporal parts theory, with all its cleverness, doesn't quite solve all the puzzles of material constitution.
That's right. But don't worry, there are even more radical solutions out there. And that brings us to eliminativism.
Eliminativism. So they're eliminating something.
You got it. And what they're eliminating are, well, the problematic objects themselves. They just say, look, those things don't actually exist, so there's no puzzle to solve.
Wow, that's a bold move.
Huh?
So what kinds of things do they eliminate?
Well, there are a few different flavors of eliminativism. One of the most extreme is called mereological nihilism.
Mereological nihilism. Sounds pretty hardcore. What's that all about?
It's the idea that there are no composite objects at all. No statues, no lumps of clay, no tables, chairs, you name it. The only things that truly exist are simple, indivisible parts.
So they're basically saying that everything is just made of tiny little Lego bricks.
Hmm.
The bigger structures we see are just illusions.
That's a pretty good analogy. And a famous proponent of this view is Peter Unger. He argues that we can still talk about things like statues and chairs, but we're really just talking about collections of symbols arranged in a certain way.
Okay, but that seems a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? I mean, it really seems like they're statues and chairs and stuff.
Yeah, and that's one of the main objections to nihilism. The incredulous stare objection. People just like, really? You're seriously telling me that this table doesn't exist? But nihilists have their defenses. They point out that our language often misleads us and that maybe what we think are composite objects are really just shorthand for talking about arrangements of symbols.
That's an interesting thought. But what if there aren't any fundamental symbols? Like, what if everything, no matter how small, can always be divided further?
That's a good point. And if reality is gunky in that way, then nihilism kind of falls apart.
So nihilism is all about simplifying things down to the bare minimum. What other kinds of eliminativism are there?
Well, there's Peter van Inwagen's view, which is a bit less extreme.
Okay, tell me about that one.
Van Inwagen says that the only composite objects that really exist are living organisms.
Living organisms. So I exist, but this microphone doesn't.
That's the gist of it, yeah. He thinks that things like statues and lumps of clay, they're just arbitrary collections of parts. They don't have the kind of unity that living things do.
Okay, so he's drawing a line between living and non-living things.
Right. But even his view has problems. For one thing, it runs into similar objections as nihilism. And there's the whole issue of vagueness. Like, where exactly do you draw the line between living and non-living? What about viruses? Are they alive? What about a brain-dead person? If there are these blurry boundaries, then it becomes unclear how many objects there are in the world, which is a problem for a lot of philosophers.
I can see how that would be a headache. Okay, so we've got the super minimalist nihilists and the slightly less minimalist living things only folks. Any other eliminativist options?
One more. Mereological essentialism.
Essentialism. So it's about, like, the essence of things.
Right, it's the view that a whole necessarily has all the parts it actually has, so it can't gain or lose parts and still be the same object.
Okay, so this one rules out the ship of Theseus scenario right off the bat.
Yep, and the debtor's paradox too. And to deal with the statue and clay puzzle, they usually add another principle. The whole is essential to the parts.
So if you have the same parts, you have the same whole.
Exactly. So in the case of David and Lump, they'd say Lump exists on Monday and Tuesday because it's made of the same clay, and David also exists on Monday and Tuesday because all his parts were already there on Monday.
Wait, so they're saying David existed before he was sculpted?
That's right. He just didn't exist as a statue yet. But all the parts that make him David were there.
That's a bit of a mind bender. And I guess that solves the problem of coincident objects because they're actually the same object.
Exactly. But of course, this view has its own problems too. Like, if you destroy even one tiny particle of David, does that mean the whole statue ceases to exist? And if David existed before he was sculpted, in what sense did he exist?
Yeah, that's definitely counterintuitive. So what do they say about that?
Well, they often try to wiggle out of these problems by talking about statue successors and things like that. But the basic idea that the whole is essential to the parts still leads to some strange conclusions.
I can see how that would be a tough one to defend. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've got the coincidence folks, the temporal parts folks, the eliminativists. Any other contenders in the material constitution arena?
We've got one more major player to talk about: dominant kinds.
Dominant kinds. Okay, I'm all ears.
So this view was put forward by Michael Burke, and it starts with a thought experiment, just like all good philosophy does. Imagine on Tuesday, we have this thing that's both a lump of clay and a statue. Let's call it
Rex.
Rex, the lump-statue hybrid. Okay, I'm visualizing it.
Now, the problem is that lumps of clay and statues seem to have different persistence conditions. A lump can survive being squashed, but a statue, defined by its shape, can't.
Right, we've been over that a few times now.
Exactly. So Burke's solution is to say that an object has the persistence conditions of its dominant kind.
Dominant kind. What makes a kind dominant? It's the kind that has the most properties associated with it. So for Rex on Tuesday, the kind statue is dominant because it includes all the physical properties of the lump plus all the artistic properties of the statue.
So a statue has a bigger property footprint, so to speak, than just lump of clay.
Right. So Rex has the persistence conditions of a statue. He can't survive being squashed. And since he has the persistence conditions of a statue, he's identical to David.
Okay, so David and Rex are one and the same. What about lump?
Well, Lump, back on Monday, his dominant kind was just lump of clay. But on Tuesday, that same lump of clay, now called Rex, has statue as its dominant kind. So they're different.
So the act of sculpting actually destroyed lump and created a new object, Rex, even though they're made of the same stuff.
That's the idea. And this view has some advantages. It avoids the radical eliminativism and lets us talk about ordinary objects. But it also has some problems. For one, it's not always clear how to determine the dominant kind. Like, what about a person posing as a statue? What's their dominant kind?
Yeah, good point. And it seems like this view doesn't really help with the ship of Theseus, right? Because there's only one kind involved there, ship.
You're right. Dominant kinds doesn't solve everything. But it's another interesting attempt to grapple with these puzzles. And that brings us to our final stop on this whirlwind tour of material constitution: relative identity.
Relative identity. Okay, I'm ready for the grand finale.
This view is a bit radical. It's associated with Peter Gooch, and he basically says that there's no such thing as absolute identity. Identity is always relative to a kind.
So you can't just say A is identical to B.
Right. You have to say A is the same K as B, where K is some kind. So you can say David is the same statue as what was once lump, or David is the same lump of clay as what was once lump. But you can't just say David is the same as lump.
Okay, so it's like the question, is David the same as lump? Doesn't even make sense unless you specify what kind of thing you're talking about.
Exactly. And this actually allows them to avoid the whole problem of spatially coincident objects, because they can say, well, yeah, David and lump aren't the same thing, but they're the same lump of clay.
So it's like a way of sidestepping the whole Leibniz's law issue, because they're not saying David and Lump are identical in an absolute sense.
Right. But even relative identity has its issues. Like if things are only the same relative to a kind, then how do we account for, just plain facts about them? Like lump existed on Monday, but David, as a statue, didn't.
Yeah, they're the same lump of clay. Shouldn't they share that property?
Exactly. And this is where things get really complex. Relative identity theorists have come up with all sorts of responses, like talking about opaque contexts and how the meaning of names like David and lump are tied to specific kinds. But there are other problems too, like how does relative identity handle cases like the ship of Theseus, where there's really only one kind involved?
Yeah, I could see how that would be tricky.
And on top of all that, rejecting absolute identity has some pretty huge implications for logic, semantics, even set theory. It's a really radical view that challenges some of the most fundamental assumptions we make about how the world works.
It sounds like it. Okay, so we've been through a lot of heavy philosophical lifting here. Coincident objects, temporal parts, eliminativism, dominant kinds, relative identity.
We've covered a lot. And there's one more perspective I want to mention, though. It's not so much a solution as a way of rethinking the whole debate. Deflationism.
Deflationism. Okay, I'm not even going to try to guess what that means.
Basically, it's the idea that maybe these big debates about material constitution aren't really about facts about the world, but about how we talk about the world.
So it's like it's all just semantics, just a matter of definition.
That's the basic idea.
Hmm.
They might say that, for example, a four-dimensionalist like Lewis and a nihilist like Unger, they might actually agree on the basic facts about the world, like how all the little particles are arranged, but they're just using different languages to describe it.
So it's like they're both looking at the same map, but they're using different legends to interpret it.
That's a good way to put it. But deflationism has its own problems. Like, it's not always clear how to identify the specific terms that are causing the disagreement. And sometimes the disagreement seems to run deeper than just language.
It's like even if we agree on the basic facts, we might still have different intuitions about what those facts mean, right?
Exactly. And in the end, it might be that these debates aren't just about language, but about some really deep, fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality.
It sounds like it. Well, what an incredible journey. We've covered so much ground here, and it's amazing to see the variety of approaches that philosophers have come up with to tackle these really fundamental puzzles about material constitution.
I know. It's mind-boggling stuff. And it shows just how deep and complex these seemingly simple questions about objects and identity really are.
And for me, what's really exciting is that these aren't just abstract philosophical problems. They have implications for how we understand everything from ourselves to the world around us to the very nature of reality itself.
Exactly. So for you, our listener, here's something to ponder. We've looked at all these different approaches to material constitution, from accepting coincident objects to denying the existence of most things, from focusing on temporal parts to emphasizing kinds, from relativizing identity to questioning the whole debate. Which one of these views speaks to you the most? Which one makes the most sense, given how?